Welcome to Sleepy Case Files, a place where quiet storytelling meets mysterious cases. Tonight, we slowly explore a story from the world of true crime. In the 1960s, Golden West Avenue in Temple City, California, was the very picture of suburban normalcy. Situated right on the border of Arcadia, it was a neighborhood of manicured lawns, quiet driveways, and families chasing the post-war American dream under the warm Southern California sun. We often think of true crime as an explosive event. A violent altercation, a sudden disappearance, a momentary lapse into madness. But the most terrifying crimes are not always sudden. Sometimes they are acts of slow, methodical, and silent erasure. Today, we are going to walk up the driveway of an unremarkable bungalow on Golden West Avenue. We are going to look at one of the most severe, prolonged, and baffling cases of child abuse, illegal confinement, and systematic torture ever recorded in American history. This is not a story of a kidnapping by a stranger. This is the story of a girl whose existence was systematically deleted by the very people supposed to protect her, while the rest of the neighborhood went about their daily lives entirely unaware. The unraveling of this meticulously hidden crime didn't begin with a police raid or an informant's tip. It began entirely by accident on the morning of October 16th, 1970. The timeline of the investigation starts not at a crime scene, but at a Los Angeles County welfare office. Irene Wiley, a 50-year-old woman, had just fled her home after a violent, terrifying altercation with her husband, Clark. Irene was suffering from severe, untreated cataracts. She was completely blind in one eye, and the vision in her other eye was rapidly deteriorating into a blurry peripheral haze. She was desperate, seeking the disability office to apply for benefits so she could finally establish some financial independence and leave her abusive marriage. But because of her failing eyesight, Irene stumbled into the wrong building in Temple City. She missed the department for the blind and instead walked into the General Social Services intake office. Holding her hand was her daughter. A social worker named Bobby Lynn Harris was working the desk that morning. When Irene approached the counter, Linhars looked at the child beside her. What she saw immediately set off a barrage of professional alarms. Irene stated that her daughter was 13 and a half years old. But the creature standing before Linhars looked no older than 6 or 7. She was astonishingly pale, practically translucent. As if she had never seen the sun, she weighed an estimated 59 pounds and stood just 4 feet, 6 inches tall. But it wasn't just her severe underdevelopment that chilled the social worker. It was the physical anomalies in her posture and movement. The girl could not stand erect. She was permanently bent forward at the waist. She held her hands up against her chest in a stiff, unnatural claw-like posture, reminiscent of a frightened animal preparing to defend itself. When she moved, it wasn't a human walk. It was a bizarre, shuffling hop. Her feet barely left the ground. Investigators would later officially document this as a bunny walk. Furthermore, the girl was entirely mute. She did not speak. She did not cry. She did not babble. She was constantly salivating and spitting onto her own clothes, unable to control her own basic bodily functions. Linhars knew immediately that this was not a standard case of poverty, malnutrition, walked into the back office and immediately called her supervisor. The supervisor took one look from a distance and contacted the Temple City Sheriff's Station. When responding deputies arrived at the welfare office, they took one look at the girl and immediately placed her into protective custody. They attempted to interview Irene Wiley on the spot, but her responses were erratic. She was terrified, visually impaired, and kept repeating that her husband, Clark, was a dangerous man who controlled everything in their home. The police realized they had a massive, unclassified crime on their hands. Before they could arrest the father or search the house, they needed hard, irrefutable evidence. They needed a medical workup to establish exactly what had been done to this child. The girl, who would soon be given the protective legal pseudonym Genie, was rushed to Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. In true crime investigations, when a victim cannot speak, their body becomes the primary crime scene. For the pediatricians and specialists at Children's Hospital, including Dr. David Rigler and Dr. Howard Hansen, Genie's body told a story of prolonged medieval torture. The initial medical assessments went far beyond simple starvation. Genie was suffering from a condition eventually classified as severe psychosocial dwarfism, but the specific physical adaptations her body had made were horrible. Because she had been confined and restrained for over a decade, her physical development had warped. Her muscles were so severely atrophied that her joints had partially frozen in place. The doctors physically could not straighten her arms or extend her legs to their full length. During the physical examination, investigators documented thick, hardened calluses on her buttocks. These were the result of sitting completely rigid on a hard plastic chair for thousands upon thousands of hours. Her dietary forensics were equally disturbing. Medical records indicated her diet had consisted almost entirely of baby food, soft cereals, and liquids, which were rapidly and forcibly spoon-fed to her. Because she had never been allowed or taught to chew solid food, her jaw and dental development were completely anomalous. She possessed two nearly complete sets of teeth, her baby teeth and her adult teeth, crowded together in her mouth. Without the friction of chewing, her baby teeth had never naturally loosened and fallen out. But perhaps the most chilling physical adaptation discovered by the medical team was her eyesight. Ophthalmologists examined Genie thoroughly. They found that her optic nerves, her retinas, and the physical structures of her eyes were completely healthy. Yet she was essentially blind to anything beyond 10 or 12 feet. The medical investigators quickly deduced the terrifying reason why. For 13 years, the walls of her bedroom were the absolute limits of her universe. Those walls were roughly 10 feet away. Her eyes had never had the opportunity to focus on a horizon, a distant tree, or a street. Because she had never needed to look far away, her brain simply had not developed the neurological capacity for distance vision. And finally, the most profound piece of forensic evidence, her absolute silence. She didn't just lack vocabulary. She possessed no understanding of grammar, syntax, or vocalization. The doctors noted that she wouldn't even cry out in pain when blood was drawn. The investigators knew this wasn't a congenital defect. This was a learned survival mechanism. Armed with this devastating medical profile, detectives obtained a search warrant for the house on Golden West Avenue. It was time to find the chamber where this had happened. bungalow. But as investigators stepped through the front door, the atmosphere shifted drastically. Crime scene investigators immediately noted a suffocating lack of sensory stimulation. The house was oppressively dark and quiet. There was no television, there was no radio. The blinds in the front of the house were permanently drawn and locked. The air felt stagnant. But the true horror, the epicenter of the crime, was waiting in a small bedroom at the rear of the house. When detectives opened the door to Genie's room, they found a meticulously designed isolation chamber. The forensics of this room would form the core of the criminal charges against the parents. Investigators first examined the windows. They weren't just closed. They were covered with heavy, opaque curtains that blocked all natural light. When detectives pulled those curtains back, they discovered that the window panes themselves had been covered with aluminum foil. Every single ray of California sunlight had been intentionally blocked. The room was kept in near total darkness, 24 hours a day. In the center of the room, investigators photographed the primary instrument of confinement, a child's potty chair, but it had been modified. Attached to this chair was a custom-made restrictive cloth harness. Through the physical evidence and later interrogations, detectives confirmed that Genie had been strapped naked into this harness for up to 13 hours a day. She was immobilized. She could move her fingers and toes, but she could not stand, walk, or shift her body weight. Against the wall sat an infant crib. Crime scene technicians noted that this too had been heavily modified. Wire mesh, similar to chicken wire, had been attached to the sides and stretched completely over the top, essentially turning the crib into a locked cage. Inside a nearby dresser drawer, investigators found a handmade, child-sized straitjacket. The evidence painted a clear, unrelenting daily routine. During the daylight hours, Genie was strapped to the potty chair, left in the dark. At night, she was bound in the straitjacket, placed into the crib, and the wire mesh was locked over her. Investigators scoured the room for any signs of childhood. Toys, books, blankets, anything to provide comfort. The evidence inventory log was shockingly brief. They found 2 plastic raincoats hanging in the closet. On the floor, they found a few empty plastic spools of cotton thread. That was her attire. Because she had been confined and restrained for over a decade, her physical development had warped. Her muscles were so severely atrophied that her joints had partially frozen in place. The doctors physically could not straighten her arms or extend her legs to their full length. During the physical examination, investigators documented thick, hardened calluses on her buttocks. These were the result of sitting completely rigid on a hard plastic chair for thousands upon thousands of hours. Her dietary forensics were equally disturbing. Medical records indicated her diet had consisted almost entirely of baby food, soft cereals, and liquids, which were rapidly and forcibly spoon-fed to her. Because she had never been allowed or taught to chew solid food, her jaw and dental development were completely anomalous. She possessed 2 nearly complete sets of teeth, her baby teeth and her adult teeth, crowded together in her mouth. Without the friction of chewing, her baby teeth had never naturally loosened and fallen out. But perhaps the most chilling physical adaptation discovered by the medical team was her eyesight. Ophthalmologists examined Genie thoroughly. They found that her optic nerves, her retinas, and the physical structures of her eyes were completely healthy. Yet she was essentially blind to anything beyond 10 or 12 feet. The medical investigators quickly deduced the terrifying reason why. For 13 years, the walls of her bedroom were the absolute limits of her universe. Those walls were roughly 10 feet away. Her eyes had never had the opportunity to focus on a horizon, a distant tree, or a street. Because she had never needed to look far away, her brain simply had not developed the neurological capacity for distance vision. And finally, the most profound piece of forensic evidence, her absolute silence. She didn't just lack vocabulary. She possessed no understanding of grammar, syntax, or vocalization. The doctors noted that she wouldn't even cry out in pain when blood was drawn. The investigators knew this wasn't a congenital defect. This was a learned survival mechanism. Armed with this devastating medical profile, detectives obtained a search warrant for the house on Golden West Avenue. It was time to find the chamber where this had happened. When detectives pulled up to the Wiley residence, they were struck by how profoundly normal it looked from the street. It was a standard California bungalow, but as investigators stepped through the front door, the atmosphere shifted drastically. Crime scene investigators immediately noted a suffocating lack of sensory stimulation. The house was oppressively dark and quiet. There was no television, there was no radio. The blinds in the front of the house were permanently drawn and locked. The air felt stagnant. But the true horror, the epicenter of the crime, was waiting in a small bedroom at the rear of the house. When detectives opened the door to Genie's room, they found a meticulously designed isolation chamber. The forensics of this room would form the core of the criminal charges against the parents. Investigators first examined the windows. They weren't just closed. They were covered with heavy, opaque curtains that blocked all natural light. When detectives pulled those curtains back, they discovered that the window panes themselves had been covered with aluminum foil. Every single ray of California sunlight had been intentionally blocked. The room was kept in near total darkness, 24 hours a day. In the center of the room, investigators photographed the primary instrument of confinement, a child's potty chair, but it had been modified. Attached to this chair was a custom-made restrictive cloth harness. Through the physical evidence and later interrogations, detectives confirmed that Genie had been strapped naked into this harness for up to 13 hours a day. She was immobilized. She could move her fingers and toes, but she could not stand, walk, or shift her body weight. Against the wall sat an infant crib. Crime scene technicians noted that this too had been heavily modified. Wire mesh, similar to chicken wire, had been attached to the sides and stretched completely over the top, essentially turning the crib into a locked cage. Inside a nearby dresser drawer, investigators found a handmade, child-sized straitjacket. The evidence painted a clear, unrelenting daily routine. During the daylight hours, Genie was strapped to the potty chair, left in the dark. At night, she was bound in the straitjacket, placed into the crib, and the wire mesh was locked over her. Investigators scoured the room for any signs of childhood. Toys, books, blankets, anything to provide comfort. The evidence inventory log was shockingly brief. They found 2 plastic raincoats hanging in a closet. On the floor, they found a few empty plastic The trial was scheduled to begin on November 20th, 1970. The media had caught wind of the story, dubbing Genie the wild child of Temple City. The public was in a frenzy, waiting to see the monster of Golden West Avenue face a judge and jury. But on the morning he was scheduled to appear in court, Clark Wiley made his final cowardly move to maintain control. While Irene and John were preparing to leave the house for the courthouse, Clark remained behind in the living room. He sat down at the table and carefully arranged 2 uncashed checks, leaving them for his son. He then picked up a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, raised it to his right temple, and pulled the trigger. When police arrived at the house, they found his body and beside it a suicide note. The note did not contain an apology. It did not express a single ounce of remorse for the 13 years of life he had stolen from his daughter, or the terror he inflicted on his family. Instead, it contained a chilling, self-pitying justification for his cruelty. He wrote a single sentence: "The world will never understand." With Clark Wiley dead by his own hand, the primary target of the criminal investigation was gone. He had escaped the justice system just hours before he was forced to face the reality of what he had done. The legal proceedings against Irene Wiley dragged on for several years, but the charges against her were ultimately dismissed in 1975. Her defense attorney successfully argued that she was a severely battered spouse, suffering from extreme physical and psychological duress, legally blind, and functionally incapable of stopping her husband's madness. The criminal investigation of the house on Golden West Avenue was officially closed, but for Genie, her journey was just beginning. She transitioned instantly from a victim of a horrific crime to a highly sought-after scientific subject. Psychologists, linguists, and researchers descended upon her, eager to use her tragic circumstances as a real-life test subject to understand language acquisition and the critical period of human brain development. For a brief period, she made progress. She learned a small vocabulary of words. She learned to smile. She learned to walk with a more natural gait. She experienced sunlight and music for the first time. But ultimately, the system supposed to protect her failed her once again. When scientific funding dried up, the researchers who had essentially become her foster parents abandoned the project. She was bounced through a series of poorly vetted state-run foster homes. In one of these homes, she was severely punished for vomiting. The trauma of this new abuse caused her to regress completely back into the absolute silence her father had beaten into her years ago. Today she is an elderly woman, living out her days in an undisclosed state-run adult care facility in Southern California, not far from the sunny streets of Arcadia and Temple City. The house on Golden West Avenue still stands. Other families have moved in and out over the decades, mowing the lawn, parking in the driveway. But the silence that once suffocated that back bedroom remains one of the loudest warnings in true crime history. That the greatest monsters do not always hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they hide right next door, behind the locked doors of polite, quiet society.